What if the first wasn't the beginning but the remnant of something older? Around 3500 BC, in the marshlands between two rivers, humanity's most sophisticated civilization emerged without warning. The Sumerians appeared with writing already perfected, cities already planned, and mathematics that calculated compound interest while the rest of the world counted on fingers. They built no pyramids, they conquered no empires. Instead, they created the invisible architecture of civilization itself, systems so fundamental we still live inside them. But they left no origin story. Their earliest records describe a fully functional society, as if they'd been taking notes for centuries before mentioning how it began. Then, as mysteriously as they appeared, they faded into silence. What remains are puzzles that don't fit how civilizations should develop, waiting for the right questions to unlock them. The wind carries nothing now across the plains where once stood. No voices calling from market stalls, no priests chanting from ziggurats, no children playing in the shade of date palms. Just silence, thick and absolute, stretching over cracked mud bricks that once formed the walls of humanity's first great cities. When archaeologists first walked these ruins in the 1850s, they found something that shouldn't exist. Tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks that predated Egyptian hieroglyphs by centuries. Names carved in stone that no empire had ever claimed, Ur-Nammu, Hammurabi's predecessor. And yet somehow this civilization had vanished so completely that for nearly 4,000 years nobody even remembered it had existed. This is what makes the Sumerians different from every other lost empire. Troy fell to Greek fire. Rome crumbled under barbarian invasions. The Maya abandoned their cities to jungle and time. But these civilizations left traces in the stories their enemies told, in the legends of the people who conquered them. Sumer simply stopped existing in human memory, as if it had been deliberately erased. Picture Uruk at its peak around 3000 BC, the world's first true metropolis, home to more people than would live in London for another 4 millennia. Vast irrigation channels carved the delta into a geometric garden, turning desert into farmland that could feed the world. Ships arrived from the Indus Valley carrying precious stones that traveled 2,000 miles to decorate the tomb of a single queen. This was not some primitive society stumbling toward civilization. This was a mature, complex culture that had already solved problems we struggle with today: urban planning, international trade, mass literacy, representative government. They had courts of law when most of the world still settled disputes with clubs. But then the cracks began to show, small at first. The irrigation that had made Sumer possible was slowly poisoning the land, leaving salt deposits that turned fertile fields into crusted wasteland. The rivers that brought life were bringing death, one harvest at a time. Trade routes shifted as northern cities grew powerful enough to bypass Sumerian middlemen. When the climate shifted around 2200 BC, the same drought that toppled Egypt's old kingdom and drove the Indus Valley people from their cities, Sumer was already weakened. The Guti came down from the Zagros like wolves, not to conquer, but to loot. The Elamites marched from the east with bronze weapons and systematic ambition. One by one, the great cities fell. But here's what's strange about the end. When fell in 2004 BC and the last king was dragged away in chains, there was no dramatic battle. The final tablets from the great libraries are not battle hymns but lamentations, formal poems of grief written in perfect cuneiform by scribes who knew their world was ending. The gods have abandoned us like migrating birds, reads one from Blood flows as the river does, the lamenting of men and women, sadness abounds. They documented their own extinction with the same methodical precision they had used to build their empire. And then, nothing. The scribal schools closed, the trade networks collapsed. The knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate simply stopped being passed on. Within a few generations, no one could read the old tablets. Within a few centuries, no one remembered there had ever been tablets to read. Some Sumerians fled north and were absorbed into Babylonian society. Others scattered to distant cities carrying fragments of their culture like refugees, carrying photographs of a home they would never see again. But somehow, the heart of what had been Sumer, that specific combination of innovation and organization that had created the world's first civilization, just vanished. Sumerian influence should be everywhere and nowhere, fundamental and invisible. Every time we divide time into 60-minute hours, we echo their mathematics. Every time we sign a contract or appear in court, we follow procedures they invented. They didn't just disappear, they dissolved into the foundations of everything that came after. But if they were so fundamental to civilization, why did the world so completely forget they had ever existed? What happened to a people who were advanced enough to predict eclipses, but somehow couldn't predict their own end? The hidden web of Sumer's trade. In a merchant's grave in archaeologists found a cylinder seal carved with elephants and rhinoceros, animals that had never walked the plains of Mesopotamia. Beside it lay fragments of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, obsidian from Anatolia. These weren't exotic gifts or royal trophies. They were inventory carefully catalogued on clay tablets that recorded weights, measures, and exchange rates with the precision of a modern ledger. The question that haunts every excavation is simple. How did Bronze Age people, working with donkey caravans and reed boats, create trade networks that wouldn't be matched until the age of sailing ships? Picture the docks of around 2500 BC, where the Euphrates met the Persian Gulf. Boats arrived daily carrying silver from Turkey, pearls from Bahrain. In the covered markets, merchants from a dozen cultures haggled in multiple languages, while scribes recorded transactions in cuneiform that would be honored in cities 2,000 miles away. The air was thick with frankincense from Arabia and the chatter of translators who could convert Sumerian grain measures into Harappan weight standards. Sumerian trade routes stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to Anatolia in the west, from the mountains of Iran to the deserts of Arabia. But here's what makes these networks truly mysterious. They operated without any central authority. No Sumerian emperor controlled the mountain passes. No Sumerian navy patrolled the sea lanes. No Sumerian colonies guarded the distant mines. Yet somehow, for over a millennium, precious goods flowed reliably along routes that crossed hostile deserts, pirate-infested waters, and territories controlled by peoples who had every reason to raid the caravans rather than protect them. The evidence appears in the strangest places. Seals carved in the distinctive Harappan style of the Indus Valley turn up in Mesopotamian archaeological layers, while Sumerian cylinder seals have been found in ancient sites across Pakistan and Afghanistan. Sumerian cuneiform tablets record the names of Meluha and Dilmun, distant lands that modern scholars identify with India and Bahrain, as if they were familiar trading partners rather than mythical kingdoms. What emerges from these scattered clues is a system of almost supernatural sophistication. Sumerian merchants developed standardized weights that were honored from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. They created letters of credit that could be carried across continents and redeemed in cities whose languages the bearer couldn't speak. They established merchant guilds that guaranteed contracts and settled disputes according to laws that transcended individual kingdoms. Even their mythology reflects this commercial worldview. The Epic of Gilgamesh sends its hero not to conquer distant lands, but to trade with them, bringing back cedar wood from Lebanon through negotiation rather than war. Their creation myths describe the gods establishing cosmic order through careful measurement and fair exchange, the universe itself imagined as a perfectly balanced transaction. The quiet genius of this system wasn't in its ambition but in its restraint. These were not conquistadors seeking to plant flags on distant shores. They were accountants with a cosmic vision, creating networks that enriched everyone they touched. Sumerian cities grew wealthy not through conquest but through service, as middlemen, translators, standardizers, and guarantors in a world that was learning to trust strangers. When other Bronze Age civilizations collapsed around 1200 BC, many of their trade routes died with them. But the Sumerian innovation, the idea that strangers could do business based on shared standards and mutual benefit, survived and spread. The weights and measures they developed became the foundation of commerce across 3 continents. The cuneiform contracts they wrote became the template for international trade law. Today, when a container ship carries goods from China to California, when banks transfer credits across time zones, when international law settles disputes between corporations that have never met face-to-face, we are using systems that trace back to those first Sumerian merchants who realized that the world could be connected not by conquest, but by trust. The roads they built were not made of stone, but of something more durable, patterns of cooperation that outlasted their cities, their empire, their very civilization. In every marketplace where strangers meet to trade, in every contract that binds people across borders, in every currency that carries value beyond its homeland, the invisible roads of Sumer still run. The origins of accounting systems. In a storage room in Uruk, archaeologists found a clay tablet covered with wedge-shaped marks that looked like bird tracks in wet mud. At first, nobody could figure out what they were looking at. The marks were too organized to be random scratches, too abstract to be pictures, but when scholars finally cracked the code, they discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about the birth of writing. It wasn't a poem, it wasn't a prayer, it was a receipt for barley and beer. This single tablet, dating to around 3200 BC, represents something almost impossible to explain. The world's first writing system emerged not to capture human thoughts or preserve great deeds, but to keep track of who owed what to whom. What makes this discovery so weird is how complete the system already was. These weren't crude tally marks or simple pictures of sheep. These were sophisticated ledgers with standardized symbols for different commodities, mathematical operations for calculating compound interest, and abstract units that could represent everything from grain to labor time. Before they wrote down a single myth, the Sumerians had created double-entry bookkeeping. The trail begins with small clay objects that look like children's toys, miniature sheep, tiny jars, cone-shaped tokens meant to represent different quantities of grain. Thousands of these tokens have been found across Mesopotamia, some dating back to 8000 BC. Merchants would count out the tokens, seal them inside clay envelopes, and send them along with shipments to distant cities. When the goods arrived, the recipient would break open the envelope and count the tokens to verify the delivery. But somebody had a brilliant idea. Instead of sealing tokens inside envelopes, why not just press the tokens into the clay surface and record their shapes? Those pressed shapes gradually became stylized marks. Those marks became symbols. Those symbols became cuneiform, the first writing system in human history, born from the need to keep receipts. Within a few centuries, these simple shipping records had evolved into something extraordinary. Clay tablets from ancient Kanesh show loan contracts with compound interest calculated to the day. Archives from Nutsi contain employment records that track individual workers across multiple projects. The palace at Mari kept inventories that would make a modern warehouse manager envious, complete with serial numbers, expiration dates, and quality grades. But here's what doesn't make sense. Sumerian accounting seems to jump from nothing to a fully formed system almost overnight. There are no practice tablets where scribes figured out how to represent numbers, no experimental phases where they tried different approaches. The earliest accounting tablets we've found are already using base 60 mathematics with complex fractional units. They're already distinguishing between different types of barley, different grades of wool, different qualities of silver. They're already calculating compound interest and depreciation schedules. It's as if someone sat down one day and invented modern bookkeeping from scratch, complete with auditing procedures and quality control standards. The level of abstract thinking required, turning concrete objects into symbolic representations, then manipulating those symbols according to mathematical rules, represents a cognitive leap that should have taken generations to develop. Even stranger is how universal their system became. Within a few centuries, Sumerian accounting standards had spread from India to Turkey. Merchants in distant cities were using Sumerian units to weigh silver, Sumerian measures to calculate grain volumes, Sumerian methods to track long-distance shipments. This wasn't conquest or colonization, it was voluntary adoption of a system so useful that everyone wanted to use it. Modern accountants still use principles the Sumerians developed 5,000 years ago, the idea of assets and liabilities, the concept of depreciation, the practice of auditing accounts. All of these trace back to those clay tablets in Uruk. Did the Sumerians really invent this system from nothing? Or did they inherit fragments of something older, something that left no traces except for the mathematical elegance that still echoes in their earliest tablets? The precision of their methods, the sophistication of their concepts, the completeness of their system from the very beginning, it all suggests they didn't stumble onto accounting by accident. They seem to have been taught by someone who already knew how to count the world. Metallurgy and the art of craftsmanship. In the British Museum sits a bronze dagger from ancient Ur, perfectly balanced, its blade sharp enough to shave with after 4,000 years. The copper and tin are mixed in precise proportions, 90% copper, 10% tin, the exact ratio modern metallurgists use for the strongest bronze. The handle is inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, the workmanship so fine it looks machine-made. This dagger wasn't a prototype or an experiment. It was produced by what appears to be a fully developed industry in the 3rd millennium BC. But here's the problem. Archaeologists have never found the failed attempts, the broken molds, the botched alloys that should mark the learning curve of any new technology. So where did the Sumerians learn to work metal with such perfection? Most civilizations leave behind evidence of technological development, crude, early attempts, gradual improvements, centuries of trial and error. Egypt shows clear progression from simple copper tools to sophisticated goldwork over many generations. Anatolia has layers of metallurgical experimentation stretching back millennia, with plenty of mistakes preserved in the archaeological record. But Sumerian metalwork appears almost fully formed from the beginning. The earliest bronze artifacts from Mesopotamia show mastery of complex techniques, 2-part mold casting, hot forging, controlled alloy ratios, surface treatments that prevent corrosion. These aren't the works of beginners figuring things out, they're products of an established tradition with centuries of accumulated knowledge. The Sumerians worked with an impressive range of metals. They smelted copper from Iranian ores, imported tin from as far as Afghanistan, refined silver from Turkish mines, and worked gold into jewelry so delicate that modern goldsmiths struggle to duplicate their techniques. But it's not just the technical skill that's puzzling, it's the completeness of their knowledge from the start. The standard of Ur, dating to 2600 BC, shows metalworkers in their workshops using techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for centuries. They understood work hardening, how repeated hammering strengthens metal. They knew about annealing, how controlled heating relieves stress in worked metal. They had mastered lost wax casting, a complex process that allows for intricate detail work. Even stranger is how they talked about metalworking. In Sumerian texts, smiths aren't described as craftsmen learning a trade, but as semi-divine figures who knew the fire of heaven and could manipulate metal through secret knowledge. The god Enki is credited with teaching humans metalworking, but the myths describe it as a gift given complete, not a skill developed over time. Were these just poetic descriptions? Or do they preserve some memory of knowledge that arrived fully formed from somewhere else? Modern archaeologists trying to recreate Sumerian techniques have had to use scientific instruments to measure the precise temperatures and alloy ratios the ancient smiths achieved without any written formulas. There are no Sumerian textbooks on metallurgy, no instruction manuals, no recorded experiments, just the finished products perfect from the beginning. Some scholars argue that the knowledge was passed down through families, closely guarded trade secrets that were never written down. Others point out that metalworking requires specific types of furnaces, precise temperature control, and exact timing, knowledge that typically takes generations to develop and refine. But the Sumerian sites don't show this gradual development. The earliest furnaces found are already sophisticated designs capable of reaching the high temperatures needed for bronze work. The earliest tools show no signs of the gradual improvement you'd expect from a learning process. It's as if someone sat down one day with a complete understanding of metallurgy and started producing masterpieces. Today, when archaeologists find a perfectly crafted Sumerian bronze axe or an intricately designed silver cup, they're looking at the products of a knowledge system that seems to have appeared without warning and vanished without explanation. The techniques were eventually passed on to other civilizations, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, but always as established methods, never as developing sciences. The light of Sumerian metallurgy still shines in museums around the world, in artifacts that showcase a level of skill that took other civilizations centuries to achieve. But that light reflects something we can't quite see clearly, a source of knowledge that illuminated the ancient world and then faded, leaving behind only its brilliant products and the question of where such mastery could have come from so suddenly. The great ziggurat of Ur. Rising from the flat mud plains of southern Iraq, 30 meters of baked brick and bitumen stretches toward empty sky. No temple crowns its summit, no burial chambers lie hidden in its core, just layer upon layer of precisely cut bricks climbing in measured steps toward nothing but air and wind. The great ziggurat of Ur stands like an artificial mountain in a land that has no mountains. After 4,000 years, it still dominates the horizon, visible from miles away across the desert. But walking around its massive base, running your hand along walls that have outlasted empires, one question echoes in the silence. What was this thing actually for? The structure itself defies easy explanation. 3 main terraces rise in perfect geometric progression, each level smaller than the one below, painted in colors that have long since faded, red, black, and blue bands that once made it shine like a jewel against the brown landscape. Staircases climb the center face, leading to a flat platform where archaeologists expected to find the remains of a temple, but found only empty space. Inside, the ziggurat is solid brick all the way through. No hidden chambers, no secret passages, no practical spaces of any kind. It's essentially a decorated brick pile that consumed more resources than most cities, required more labor than most palaces, and served no obvious function that couldn't have been accomplished more simply and cheaply elsewhere. King Ur-Nammu began construction around 2100 BC, and his son Shulgi completed it, a project spanning decades, involving thousands of workers, consuming materials that could have built a dozen ordinary temples. The engineering is sophisticated: drainage channels to prevent water damage, expansion joints to handle temperature changes, a foundation design that has kept it stable through 40 centuries of earthquakes and floods. But engineering for what purpose? Early archaeologists assumed it was a temple platform, a way to get closer to the gods by building up toward the sky. Sumerian texts mention ziggurats as places where heaven and earth meet, where deities could descend to interact with mortals. But if that were true, why is the top so bare? Where are the altars, the sacred objects, the evidence of ritual activity? Some scholars suggest the ziggurat functioned as a massive sundial, its shadows marking the passage of seasons and helping priests calculate the ritual calendar. Others see it as a landmark for navigation, a beacon visible across the flat landscape that guided travelers and traders to the city. Still others interpret it as pure political theatre, a monument designed not for gods but for people, a concrete demonstration of royal power that could be seen and understood by anyone within a day's walk. Standing on top of the ziggurat today, looking out over the ruins of Ur spread below, you can feel the weight of intentional design. From this height, a king or priest would appear silhouetted against the sky, visible to crowds gathered in the courtyards below. The structure transforms anyone who climbs it into a figure of authority, elevated above the ordinary world, commanding attention through simple presence. When architecture moves beyond shelter and storage into pure form, it becomes ritual. The ziggurat doesn't house the sacred, it creates it through the act of rising, of separating, of making some people higher than others. It's a machine for manufacturing reverence, built not to hide power but to display it. The shape itself seems to carry some deep psychological trigger. Long after the Sumerians were gone, other cultures kept building stepped pyramids. The Maya in Central America, the Cambodians at Angkor, the architects of medieval cathedrals with their soaring spires. The impulse to build upward, to create artificial mountains, to separate the sacred from the ordinary by lifting it toward the sky, appears again and again across cultures that had no contact with Sumer. Even today, city skylines compete in vertical ambition, corporate towers assert dominance through height, and religious buildings still reach upward as if something important lives above the clouds. The ziggurat's lesson, that power can be literally elevated, that authority can be built rather than inherited, has never been forgotten. Walking away from the ruins across the desert where Ur's markets once hummed with trade, the ziggurat still watches from its artificial height. Not a tomb, not a temple, but something more enduring, a stone reminder that humans have always built upward, not just to reach the gods, but to remind each other where they stand. Complex burial rituals. In a tomb beneath the ancient city of Ur, archaeologists found Queen Piabi surrounded by impossible wealth. Her body wore a golden headdress that weighed nearly 5 pounds, earrings carved from lapis lazuli, rings and bracelets that caught the excavator's flashlight like trapped stars. She had been dead for over 4,000 years, but she looked like royalty prepared for a ceremony that was about to begin. Around her lay 74 other bodies arranged in perfect rows. Musicians clutched their lyres and harps, guards held their spears, servants wore their finest clothes, golden ribbons still bright in their hair. They lay as if they had simply decided to take a nap together, showing no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. The question that has haunted archaeologists since Leonard Woolley first opened these tombs in the 1920s is simple and terrible. How did all these people die? The royal cemetery of Ur revealed not just graves but entire underground theatres of death. Each royal burial was accompanied by what Woolley called death pits, carefully arranged scenes that looked like palace life frozen in time. Ox-drawn chariots with their drivers still at the reins, court musicians positioned as if in the middle of a performance, ladies in waiting arranged in precise formation, their jewellery glinting in the darkness. These weren't random mass graves or the aftermath of a massacre. Every body was positioned with deliberate care. Every object was placed according to some ceremonial logic. The whole scene was choreographed like a play where the final act was death itself, and everyone knew their role. Queen Puabi's tomb alone contained evidence of a ceremony that must have taken days to arrange. The bodies weren't thrown in hurriedly. They were dressed in their finest clothes, adorned with jewelry that marked their rank, positioned according to strict protocol. Someone had spent enormous resources and careful planning to create this underground tableau, this frozen moment of royal power extending beyond life into death. But the mechanics remain a mystery. Modern forensic analysis has found no obvious cause of death for most of the bodies. Some show signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, suggesting they were killed with a quick blow. Others show no trauma at all, leading some researchers to speculate about poison, perhaps something mixed into ceremonial wine that would allow people to lie down peacefully and never wake up. The most disturbing possibility is that some of these people chose to die. In a society where serving the king was the highest honor imaginable, following him into the afterlife might have been seen as the ultimate privilege. Sumerian texts speak of death as a journey that required servants and supplies, just like any royal expedition. Perhaps these courtiers saw themselves not as victims, but as the chosen few selected to continue their service in eternity. What emerges from these underground chambers isn't just evidence of elaborate burial customs, but a glimpse of power in its most absolute form. The ability to command not just life, but death, to extend royal authority beyond the grave, to transform murder into ritual and call it honor. These tombs weren't built to comfort the dead. They were designed to terrify the living, to demonstrate that royal power had no limits, not even mortality. The scale of these ceremonies staggers the imagination. A single royal burial could consume more wealth than most cities possessed, require the death of dozens of people, involve craftsmen and priests and undertakers in a production that might have taken months to plan and execute. The kingdom was essentially mounting an elaborate theatrical performance where the audience was eternity itself. And then, as mysteriously as they began, these mass burials stopped. Later, Sumerian kings were buried alone or with minimal grave goods. Either the society could no longer afford such extravagance, or the rulers lost the ability to command such absolute obedience from their subjects. The era of the death pits ended, but it left behind questions that archaeology can't fully answer. Standing in the restored tomb chambers today, looking at the spaces where all those bodies once lay in their eternal service, you can feel the weight of a system that treated human life as just another luxury good to be consumed by power. The silence in those underground rooms isn't peaceful. It's the silence of voices that were never allowed to refuse, of people whose last act was to lie down in formation and wait for whatever came next. Perhaps what these tombs really preserve isn't the glory of Sumerian royalty, but evidence of their deepest fear. That death might mean being forgotten, that power might not survive the grave. In their desperate attempt to drag their entire world into eternity with them, they revealed not strength, but a terror of insignificance so profound they were willing to commit mass murder to avoid it. The gold and lapis lazuli have survived 4 millennia, but the names of those who died serving Queen Puabi are lost forever. The gender-neutral servants of Inanna. On a stone relief from ancient Uruk, a figure dances before the goddess Inanna, arms raised in graceful supplication. The dancer wears flowing robes and an elaborate headdress, moves with distinctly feminine gestures, and holds the sacred instruments of temple ritual. But the body beneath the costume is clearly male. Cuneiform inscriptions identify this person as a gala, one of Inanna's sacred mourners, whose role required them to exist outside the boundaries of ordinary gender. The question that emerges from studying dozens of similar carvings is simple but profound. Did the world's first civilization recognize something we've only recently begun to discuss? The existence of people who don't fit neatly into male or female categories? Inside the temple complexes of ancient Sumer, during the harvest festivals dedicated to Inanna, the air would fill with smoke and drumbeats as hundreds of people gathered for rituals that could last for days. Among the dancers would be the Gala, the Kurgaru, and the Asinu, people whose identities transcended the gender roles that governed everyone else in society. They would beat their chests, tear their skin, and wail in voices that rose and fell like wind through empty buildings. The crowds that watched didn't laugh or point. These weren't performers putting on a show. They were sacred intermediaries, people whose very existence made them capable of bridging the gap between the world of humans and the realm of gods. The Sumerian language had specific words for these roles, and the meanings are preserved in cuneiform dictionaries. Gala was written with symbols combining male and female anatomy, suggesting people who embodied both or neither. Kurgaru referred to individuals whose bodies didn't conform to typical male or female development, what we might today call intersex, but who held honored positions as performers in religious drama. Asinu described temple servants who dressed and acted in ways that crossed gender lines, taking on roles typically associated with women while maintaining their own distinct identity. These weren't marginalized outcasts or curiosities tolerated by an otherwise rigid society. Administrative tablets show Gala receiving regular salaries from temple treasuries. Legal documents record them owning property, entering contracts, and participating fully in economic life. Some have male names, others have names that don't specify gender at all. In Sumerian mythology, the Gala were created by Inanna specifically to be neither male nor female, beings who could rescue her from the underworld because they belonged fully to neither the world of the living nor the dead. During the ritual reenactment of Inanna's journey to the underworld, one of Sumer's most important religious dramas, it was often a Kurgaru who played the goddess herself. They would dress in 7 layers of clothing, then strip away each layer as they passed through the 7 gates of death, their voice shifting from high to low, their movements becoming increasingly desperate as they enacted the goddess's humiliation and eventual resurrection. This wasn't theatre in any sense we might recognize. It was sacred performance where the boundaries between performer and deity, between ritual and reality, dissolved entirely. The person playing Inanna didn't represent the goddess, they became her, their ambiguous gender allowing them to embody a divine figure who was herself beyond human categories. What makes this ancient acceptance even more remarkable is how completely it was later forgotten. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved and came under the influence of other cultures, the roles of the Gala and their companions gradually diminished. Babylonian and Assyrian texts began to describe gender-variant people in increasingly negative terms as deviant or corrupted rather than sacred. The honored intermediaries became outcasts, their spiritual roles redefined as moral failures. For thousands of years, the very idea that ancient civilizations might have recognized more than two genders was simply unthinkable to most historians. When early archaeologists found images of gender-variant temple servants, they often described them as evidence of ancient decadence or primitive confusion about natural categories. The possibility that these people might have held respected positions might have been seen as especially blessed or spiritually gifted didn't occur to scholars working within their own cultural assumptions about gender and sexuality. But the tablets don't lie. Scattered across museum collections around the world are thousands of cuneiform documents that mention Gala by name, record their activities, and describe their importance to religious life. They were teachers who trained younger servants, administrators who managed temple resources, and artists who preserved some of Sumer's most beautiful, sacred music. Their existence wasn't a footnote to Sumerian culture, it was woven into the very fabric of how that culture understood the relationship between human and divine. In recognizing people who lived outside binary gender categories, the Sumerians weren't being progressive by modern standards. They were simply acknowledging what they saw as a fundamental truth, that some people are meant to exist in the spaces between ordinary classifications, serving as bridges across the gaps that separate different kinds of existence. The legendary city of Aratta. On a broken clay tablet from ancient Uruk, only a few lines remain legible. The god has chosen Uruk, but from Aratta, gold still flows. The beginning is lost, the author unknown, but the words echo across 4,000 years with a strange persistence. They speak of a city that may never have existed except in the minds of people who needed it to be real. Perhaps every civilization requires its perfect rival, a shadow self that defines what it is by showing what it is not. The epic of Enmerkar, one of the earliest narrative poems ever written, tells the story of a contest between two cities. Enmerkar, king of Uruk, demands that Aratta send precious materials for building a temple to the goddess Inanna. The lord of Aratta refuses, claiming that Inanna belongs to his city, not to Uruk. What follows is not a war in any conventional sense, but something stranger, a battle fought with riddles and magic spells, messenger journeys and poetic challenges. No armies march, no walls are breached. Instead, the two kings compete to prove which city deserves divine favor, exchanging elaborate threats and philosophical arguments about the nature of power and the will of the gods. It reads less like military history than like a theological debate wrapped in the language of epic poetry. The contest between Uruk and Aratta isn't about territory or trade routes. It's about something more fundamental. Which civilization has the right to call itself blessed? Which king can claim to speak for the gods? Which city represents the perfect expression of human achievement? Aratta exists in the poem not as a place but as a question mark, a challenge to Uruk's assumption that it is the center of the world. But when archaeologists began searching for the historical Aratta, they found something troubling. Despite decades of excavation across the regions where the epic places this magnificent rival city, no site has emerged that matches the descriptions in Sumerian texts. There are impressive Bronze Age settlements in the Iranian plateau, Jiroft with its carved stone vessels, Shahdad with its elaborate metalwork, Tepe Yahya with its administrative archives, but none of them quite fits the profile of the golden city that supposedly challenged Uruk for supremacy. The absence of clear archaeological evidence raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Aratta never existed as a physical place? What if it was always a literary creation, a necessary fiction that allowed Sumerian storytellers to explore questions they couldn't address directly. Consider what Arata represents in the epic poems. While Uruk is described as a city of walls and temples, of organized religion and centralized power, Arata is portrayed as a place of artists and craftsmen, of gold and lapis lazuli, of creative inspiration flowing directly from divine sources. If Uruk represents order and authority, Arata embodies beauty and transcendence. They are not so much geographical rivals as philosophical alternatives. This dynamic, the need for a perfect rival that embodies everything your own civilization both envies and rejects, appears again and again throughout history. Rome needed Carthage not just as an enemy to defeat, but as a mirror that reflected Roman values by contrast. Athens defined itself against Sparta. Medieval Christians created elaborate mental maps of Jerusalem that bore little resemblance to the actual city, but served crucial psychological functions. Arata may have served a similar role for the Sumerians. It was the place where their own ambitions and anxieties could be projected and examined safely, the eternal other that made Uruk's identity possible. In claiming victory over Arata, Sumerian kings weren't conquering a foreign city. They were symbolically resolving the tensions within their own culture, proving that power and beauty, order and inspiration could coexist under the rule of a worthy monarch. The epic tells us that after many challenges and magical tests, Enmerkar finally triumphs over his rival. But the victory is strangely hollow. Arata doesn't fall like Troy or burn like Rome. It simply fades from the story, becoming increasingly distant and irrelevant until it disappears entirely from later Sumerian literature. The perfect rival had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Yet the literary pattern established by Arata proved remarkably durable. The motif of the distant golden city, the kingdom beyond the horizon where things are done differently and better, reappears in Babylonian myths, Persian legends, and biblical accounts of Eden. Each culture relocates this imaginary realm to fit its own geographical and spiritual landscape, but the underlying structure remains the same. Somewhere out there is a place that represents what we have lost, what we aspire to become, or what we need to overcome to prove our worth. Arata lives on in the margins of maps that were never drawn, in the gaps between archaeological sites, in the eternal horizon that recedes just far enough to remain forever mysterious. It doesn't matter whether it was real. What matters is that for the Sumerians it was always there, a whisper of possibility, a reminder that beyond every civilization lies another way of being human. The language with no relatives. The cuneiform signs march across a clay tablet from ancient Nippur, recording the deeds of a Sumerian king who ruled 4,000 years ago. Modern scholars can read these words, understand their grammar, and translate their meaning. Babylonian scribes 2 millennia ago could do the same. But no one, not then, not now, can explain why this language exists in complete isolation from every other form of human speech ever recorded. In the family tree of world languages, Sumerian stands alone like a tree with no roots, no branches, and no relatives anywhere in the linguistic landscape. Most languages belong to families. English is Germanic, which is Indo-European, which connects it to everything from Sanskrit to Swedish. Arabic is Semitic, related to Hebrew and Aramaic. Even the most isolated languages usually show some traces of kinship, shared words borrowed from neighbors, similar sounds that suggest common ancestry, grammatical structures that echo distant relationships. But Sumerian appears to have sprung from nowhere, fully formed and completely unique. It's what linguists call an isolate, a language without linguistic relatives, like Basque in Europe or Japanese in Asia. Except Sumerian is older than any of these, and its isolation is more complete. It's the first written language in human history, and it seems to have no evolutionary predecessors or descendants. This creates a puzzle that has frustrated linguists for over a century. Languages don't just appear out of thin air. They develop over millennia through gradual change, splitting and merging like branches of a river. They borrow from their neighbors, adapt to new environments, and leave traces of their origins in their vocabulary and grammar. But Sumerian shows none of these normal patterns of linguistic development. The geographic distribution makes the mystery even stranger. Sumerian was spoken in the heart of Mesopotamia, surrounded by speakers of Semitic languages like Akkadian, Elamite languages from Iran, and various other linguistic families. Yet none of these neighbors show any deep structural similarities to Sumerian. It's as if a completely foreign language had been dropped into the middle of the ancient Middle East and took root there without any connection to the linguistic soil around it. Early scholars proposed various solutions to the puzzle. Maybe Sumerian was the remnant of an ancient language family that had once dominated the region before being replaced by Semitic speakers. But if that were true, where are the other members of this family? Why don't we find traces of cousin languages in neighboring regions? Others suggested that the Sumerians were immigrants who brought their language from somewhere else, perhaps the Iranian plateau or the mountains of Anatolia or even more distant regions. But archaeological evidence for such a migration is weak, and no matter where scholars look, they can't find another language that resembles Sumerian closely enough to suggest a common origin. A few desperate linguists even proposed that Sumerian was an artificial language created by scribes for administrative purposes, essentially the world's first constructed language like Esperanto. But this theory collapsed as soon as scholars recognized that Sumerian shows all the signs of a natural language that developed through normal processes of human communication. It has irregular verbs, idiomatic expressions, and the kind of messy complexity that only emerges when people use a language for real life, not when they design one for specific purposes. What makes the mystery particularly haunting is how long Sumerian survived after it ceased to be a spoken language. By 2000 BC, Akkadian had largely replaced Sumerian in daily conversation, but Sumerian didn't disappear. Instead, it became the sacred and scholarly language of Mesopotamian civilization, the Latin of the ancient Middle East. For the next 2,000 years, scribes in Babylon and Assyria continued to learn Sumerian in school, copying out ancient texts and creating bilingual dictionaries. They used it for religious ceremonies, legal formulations, and learned literature. Kings continued to use Sumerian phrases in their inscriptions to show their education and connection to ancient traditions. Modern computational linguistics has added new tools to the investigation. Scholars can now analyze the statistical properties of Sumerian grammar, compare its sound patterns to hundreds of other languages, and search for subtle similarities that might have been missed by earlier researchers. But these sophisticated methods have only deepened the mystery. Sumerian remains as linguistically isolated as ever. The persistence of the puzzle raises unsettling questions about what we don't know about the ancient world. If Sumerian truly was the language of the world's first urban civilization, and if it really has no relatives anywhere in the human linguistic family, what does that say about the origins of complex society? Did the Sumerians represent some completely unique development in human cultural evolution? Or are we missing crucial pieces of the story, languages and cultures that disappeared so completely they left no traces for us to find? Perhaps the answer lies buried in sites we haven't yet excavated, preserved in tablets we haven't yet found. Or perhaps Sumerian will remain forever what it is now, a voice from the past, speaking in words we can understand but in patterns that remind us how much about human history remains completely mysterious. The king list that defies time. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The line is carved in pristine cuneiform on the Weld Blundell prism, a four-sided clay column that contains one of humanity's earliest attempts at comprehensive history. But the very next entry presents a problem that has puzzled scholars for over a century. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Nearly 30,000 years for a single reign. By that reckoning, King Alulim would have ruled longer than all of recorded human history. Either the Sumerians had a very different understanding of time, or they weren't writing history at all. The Sumerian king list reads like the minutes of a cosmic board meeting where divine authority passes from city to city in orderly succession. Each entry follows the same format: the name of the city, the name of its ruler, and the precise number of years of their reign. But the numbers are staggering. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Dumuzid the shepherd held power for 36,000 years. The shortest pre-flood reign listed is a mere 18,600 years. Then comes the Great Flood, and suddenly everything changes. Post-flood kings have more reasonable lifespans, a few decades, a century at most. Some of these later rulers can even be verified through archaeology. Gilgamesh appears on the list as a historical king of Uruk, and his reign aligns roughly with archaeological evidence from that city. Ur-Nammu and his successors left behind inscriptions and monuments that confirm their existence. This creates a puzzle that goes to the heart of how we understand ancient thinking. The same document that preserves genuine historical information about verifiable rulers also claims that earlier kings lived for geological spans of time. Did they not understand the difference between myth and history? The structure of the king list suggests it served functions beyond mere record-keeping. It begins with kingship descending from heaven, not emerging through human political development, but arriving as a divine gift. Each city that receives this sacred authority holds it for a precisely specified period before it passes on to the next designated recipient. The arrangement isn't random, it follows clear theological and political logic. Consider the possibility that the king list wasn't intended as a historical record but as a constitutional document. In this reading, the massive lifespans of the earliest kings reflect not chronological time but cosmic time, the deep, slow rhythms by which divine authority organizes the universe. The pre-flood kings aren't individual humans, but archetypal figures representing the stable, ordered phases of cosmic history. The flood serves as a crucial transition point, marking the boundary between the age when gods ruled directly through their representatives and the more recent period when human kings exercised divine authority within mortal limitations. Post-flood rulers lived normal lifespans not because the scribes suddenly discovered realistic chronology, but because the nature of kingship itself had changed after the Great Catastrophe. The king list survives in multiple versions from different cities and periods, but the core structure remains consistent. This suggests it served as something like a shared constitutional mythology for Mesopotamian civilization, a common story about how political authority works that could be adapted to local circumstances while maintaining its essential meaning. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes continued copying and updating the king list for over 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, adding their own dynasties to the eternal succession. Even when the political world it originally described had vanished completely, the document retained its power to organize historical consciousness around divine patterns of authority. The mysterious handbag motif in Sumerian art. On a carved stone panel from the palace at Nimrud, a winged figure with an eagle's head stands beside the sacred tree of life. In one hand, it holds what appears to be a pine cone or flower. In the other hand, it carries something that looks remarkably familiar to modern eyes, a small bag with a curved handle and rectangular body decorated with parallel lines that suggest careful craftsmanship. This handbag appears everywhere in Mesopotamian art, carved into palace walls, pressed into cylinder seals, painted on temple murals. From the earliest Sumerian period through the Neo-Assyrian Empire, spanning nearly 2 millennia, gods and divine messengers carry this mysterious object with consistent care. But despite thousands of depictions across hundreds of archaeological sites, no one has ever definitively explained what it represents. What could be so important that every major civilization in Mesopotamian history felt compelled to show their gods carrying it? The object appears in remarkably consistent form across cultures and centuries. Whether carved by Sumerian artists in 2500 BC or Assyrian sculptors in 700 BC, the basic design remains unchanged, a small container with an arched handle, flat bottom, and detailed surface decoration that suggests it held something precious. It's always carried by divine or semi-divine figures, never by ordinary humans, and always appears in contexts related to sacred trees, ritual purification, or the blessing of kings. The consistency is striking. In a world where artistic styles evolved constantly, where empires rose and fell, where languages changed and religions adapted, this single motif remained essentially unchanged for over 1,000 years. Whatever it represented was so fundamental to Mesopotamian religious thinking that it transcended all cultural transformations. Various theories have been proposed to explain the mysterious object. The most conventional scholarly interpretation suggests it's a bucket for carrying sacred water or oil used in purification rituals. The accompanying pine cone would then be a sprinkler or aspergillum used to scatter blessed liquid onto trees, animals, or people. This reading fits with what we know about Mesopotamian religious practices, which emphasized the purifying power of specially consecrated substances. Other interpretations push further into speculative territory. Some see the handbag as a container for medicinal plants or magical substances, a divine pharmacy that gods use to heal or bless their human subjects. The careful way figures hold these objects, never casually but always with ceremonial precision, suggests contents too valuable to risk dropping or spilling. The mystery deepens when you consider what's missing from the depictions. These bags are never shown being opened, never depicted with their contents visible, never illustrated in the process of being filled or emptied. The figures carry them like sacred relics that must be protected rather than tools designed for practical use. This suggests the objects might be more symbolic than functional, representations of divine authority or sacred knowledge rather than actual containers. Looking at these ancient carvings today, you're struck by how carefully the artists rendered every detail of the mysterious bags, the texture of their surfaces, the precise curve of their handles, the way divine fingers grip them with appropriate reverence. Someone spent considerable time and skill creating these images, suggesting they carried significant meaning for their original audiences. The handbags remain stubbornly mysterious, carried by gods across millennia of art, but never explained, never opened, never fully understood. They remind us that ancient civilizations had ways of preserving and transmitting meaning that don't translate easily across the gap of centuries. In the end, these divine figures continue to carry their mysterious burdens through the corridors of museums around the world, holding tight to secrets we may never fully comprehend. They didn't carve explanations, they carved only images, and in those images divine hands forever grasped something that was never meant to be opened, only carried with eternal care. Strange symbols on Sumerian seals. On a cylinder seal carved over 4,000 years ago, Two figures in horned caps stand on either side of what appears to be a pillar topped with an eye. Beneath their feet, impossible creatures, part lion, part bird, part something else entirely, prowl in eternal procession. There are no words on this seal, no cuneiform script to explain the scene. Just images that once spoke a language we can no longer read. When rolled across wet clay, this tiny stone cylinder would have left its mark on documents, storage jars, and sealed doorways throughout ancient Sumer. But what exactly did that mark communicate beyond simple ownership? Cylinder seals were the signatures of the ancient world, small works of art that served as personal identification for everyone from palace scribes to grain merchants. The technology emerged around 3300 BC in the city of Uruk and quickly spread throughout Mesopotamia, becoming so common that archaeologists have catalogued tens of thousands of examples. Each seal was unique, carved by skilled artisans who compressed complex scenes into spaces no larger than a modern thimble. The earliest seals were primarily administrative tools, pressed into clay to mark ownership or authorize transactions. But as the tradition developed, something more elaborate began to emerge. Instead of simple identifying marks, seals began to feature intricate mythological scenes, gods and goddesses, sacred animals, ritual ceremonies, cosmic trees surrounded by winged beings. These images weren't random decorations. They followed recognizable patterns that suggest shared meaning within Sumerian visual culture. Many seals depict what appear to be religious or ceremonial scenes, a figure in flowing robes presenting an offering to a seated deity, mythical beasts flanking a sacred tree, boat journeys across stylized waters populated by fish and birds. The compositions are carefully balanced, with central figures drawing the eye, while supporting elements create narrative context. These aren't casual sketches, but sophisticated visual statements that once communicated specific ideas to people who understood their symbolic language. But alongside these recognizable mythological scenes, many seals contain symbols that remain completely mysterious. Strange geometric patterns repeat across multiple examples with no obvious meaning. Hybrid creatures combine elements from different animals and plants in ways that don't correspond to any known mythology. Abstract signs and marks appear in consistent arrangements that suggest systematic meaning but resist all attempts at interpretation. Consider the recurring appearance of what scholars call the horned tree, a plant-like form with branches that terminate in curved projections resembling animal horns. This motif appears on dozens of seals from different periods and locations, always rendered with careful attention to detail, always positioned in scenes of apparent importance. But no cuneiform text has ever been found that mentions such a tree. No mythological reference explains its significance. Similarly puzzling are the rectangular forms marked with eye-like circles that appear on many seals. These objects are clearly meaningful. They're often held by divine figures or positioned at the center of ceremonial scenes, but their function and symbolism remain opaque. They don't match any known ritual implements described in Sumerian texts, nor do they correspond to architectural or technological objects familiar from archaeological excavations. What emerges from studying these enigmatic symbols is the sense of a sophisticated visual grammar that once operated alongside the written, cuneiform system. The seals suggest that Sumerians had developed ways of encoding complex ideas through purely visual means, creating images that could communicate specific messages to anyone who understood the symbolic conventions, the positioning of figures, the direction of their gazes, the relative size of different elements, the specific combinations of symbols. All of these factors appear to follow consistent rules that once made these images readable as texts. A raised hand in one position might indicate blessing, while the same gesture in a different context could signify authority or warning. The presence of certain animals or objects might modify the meaning of the entire composition. But unlike cuneiform writing, which was eventually deciphered through bilingual texts and systematic analysis, the visual language of the cylinder seals offers no such interpretive keys. The symbols exist in isolation, surrounded by mystery. We can see that they once formed a coherent system of communication, but we cannot reconstruct the knowledge that would allow us to read them. The seals continue to make their marks when rolled across modern clay, but they no longer speak. They've become artifacts of a conversation we can observe, but cannot join messages from a civilization that once knew how to read the language of images and now leaves us to wonder what stories these stones were trying to tell. The sky weapons in Sumer's oldest myths. In the Epic of Lugale, carved in cuneiform across dozens of clay tablets, the god Ninurta returns victorious from his battle against the stone demon Asag. But what makes this ancient war story truly strange isn't the monster he fought, it's the weapon he carried. Ninurta's mace, called Sharur, doesn't just strike his enemies. According to the text, it speaks to him, offers strategic advice, and scouts ahead to warn of dangers before Ninurta himself can see them. This isn't a metaphor for wisdom in battle. The Sumerian text describes Sharur as literally conversational, capable of independent thought and action. It's a weapon with a mind of its own. The concept of divine weapons appears throughout Sumerian literature, but these aren't the familiar swords and spears of human warfare. Instead, they're described in language that defies easy categorization, tools that seem to exist somewhere between the physical and spiritual realms, instruments of divine will that operate according to rules we can't quite understand. Sharur, whose name means crusher of thousands, serves as both weapon and counselor to Ninurta. In the epic, it returns from reconnaissance missions to report on enemy positions, analyzes tactical situations, and even negotiates with other divine forces on Ninurta's behalf. The text presents this as perfectly normal behavior for a properly functioning divine weapon. It's as if consciousness and destructive power were naturally linked in the Sumerian understanding of how gods conducted warfare. The goddess Inanna possessed an equally remarkable arsenal. Her weapons are described not as crafted objects but as manifestations of cosmic force, wheels of fire that could shatter city walls, lightning that could be directed with surgical precision, storms that would obey her commands. During her famous descent to the underworld, she's forced to surrender these weapons at each of the 7 gates, and their descriptions read more like powers being stripped away than physical objects being confiscated. One passage describes Inanna's weapons as being stored in an underground armory, kept in readiness but used only in the most extreme circumstances. They're portrayed not as tools but as barely restrained forces of nature, dangerous even to their wielder if not properly controlled. The text suggests these weapons required ritual preparation and divine authorization before they could be safely activated. What makes these descriptions particularly unsettling is their specificity. The Sumerians weren't writing abstract poetry about divine power. They were recording detailed accounts of weapons that behaved in ways that don't match anything from conventional ancient warfare. Sharur doesn't just hit hard, it provides intelligence gathering. Inanna's firewheels don't just burn, they make tactical decisions about which targets to engage. This becomes even more mysterious when we consider the Sumerian flood narrative. In the Ziusudra epic and related texts, the destruction of the antediluvian world is attributed to what the texts call the weapon of storm, or the fire of heaven. The descriptions don't match any natural disaster in the archaeological record. Instead, they read like accounts of deliberate destruction carried out with tools specifically designed for planetary-scale devastation. The flood isn't presented as divine wrath expressed through natural phenomena, but as the result of weapon systems being activated by gods who had decided the current world needed to be erased. The careful way the texts describe the process, the consultation among divine authorities, the reluctant decision to deploy ultimate weapons, the precise timing of the destruction reads more like military planning than mythological storytelling. After the flood, according to these same texts, the gods made a remarkable decision. They sealed away the weapons that had destroyed the previous world, hiding them in places that are described but never named. Enlil, the god who had authorized the destruction, decreed that certain types of weapons should never be used again, that some powers were too dangerous even for gods to wield safely. This raises an uncomfortable question. Were the Sumerians recording memories of actual weapons technology, preserved through oral tradition and encoded in mythological language? The descriptions are too detailed to be pure fantasy, too consistent across different texts to be accidental, and too specific in their technical language to be merely symbolic. What's most haunting about these divine weapon texts is how they end. After describing tools of unimaginable power in careful detail, the stories conclude with those same weapons being deliberately forgotten. Names are struck from records, operating procedures are restricted to a few divine authorities. The weapons themselves are hidden in locations that are removed from all maps and memories. It's as if the Sumerians were preserving the knowledge that such things had once existed, while simultaneously ensuring that practical information about creating or using them would be lost forever. They remembered just enough to serve as a warning, but not enough to enable repetition. Standing in a museum today, reading translations of these ancient texts, you're confronting stories that don't fit comfortably into our categories of mythology or history. They're too fantastic to be literal accounts, too detailed to be pure imagination, too consistent to be accidental invention. The clay tablets that contain these stories continue to puzzle archaeologists and linguists who can translate the words but struggle to understand what kind of reality, historical, mythological, or something else entirely, they were meant to preserve. The mystery of Sumerian astronomical knowledge. For a civilization that planted crops by the stars, timed religious festivals by planetary movements, and structured their entire calendar around celestial cycles, the Sumerians must have possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But when we try to reconstruct exactly what they knew about the cosmos, we encounter a puzzle. Their understanding appears to be both more extensive and more alien than we initially suspected. How did people without telescopes develop such precise knowledge of celestial phenomena, and why did they organize this knowledge in ways that seem so foreign to modern astronomical thinking? The primary source for ancient Mesopotamian astronomy is a collection of tablets compiled during the Neo-Babylonian period but preserving much older Sumerian astronomical traditions. These tablets contain detailed catalogues of stars and constellations, precise timing for their rising and setting, and sophisticated calculations for predicting celestial events. The star names and observational data clearly draw from centuries of careful sky-watching that began in Sumerian times. But the way this astronomical knowledge is organized reveals a completely different approach to understanding the heavens. Instead of mapping the sky geometrically like Greek astronomers, the Sumerians classified celestial objects by function and meaning. Stars weren't points of light at various distances. They were divine beings with personalities, responsibilities, and relationships to earthly events. Consider their constellation names. The Plough, which corresponds roughly to our Taurus, wasn't defined by its visual appearance, but by its role in marking agricultural seasons. The true shepherd of heaven, identified with Orion, was seen as a divine figure guiding other celestial beings across the sky. The raven, corresponding to Corvus, was associated with messages and omens. Each constellation carried both observational data and mythological meaning in a unified system of cosmic understanding. This integration of practical astronomy with religious significance created remarkably precise knowledge. Sumerian tablets record the heliacal rising of stars, the dates when they first become visible before dawn after a period of invisibility, with accuracy that modern astronomers have verified through computer models. They tracked the complex cycles of planetary motion, noting when Mars, Venus, and Mercury would disappear from view and predicting their return to visibility. Most remarkably, some tablets appear to describe what modern astronomers call retrograde motion, the apparent backward movement of planets against the stellar background. Without understanding the heliocentric model of the solar system, Sumerian observers somehow recognized that certain planetary behaviors followed predictable patterns of disappearance, backward motion, and reappearance. Their astronomical knowledge was deeply embedded in practical applications. The heliacal rising of Sirius, which they called the Arrow star, was used to predict the annual flooding of rivers. The appearance of specific constellations determined when to plant barley, when to harvest dates, and when to begin various crafts. The timing of religious festivals was synchronized with celestial events, creating a sacred calendar that aligned human activities with cosmic rhythms. This practical astronomy reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Sumerian tablets describe a lunar-solar calendar that reconciled the 29.5-day lunar month with the 365.25-day solar year through complex intercalation systems. They tracked the 8-year cycle of Venus appearances, the 19-year Metonic cycle that brings lunar and solar calendars back into alignment, and longer astronomical periods that wouldn't be rediscovered until much later in history. But perhaps most intriguing are the astronomical references that we cannot fully decode. Some star names mentioned in Sumerian texts have no clear modern counterparts. Either these refer to stars that have changed brightness over the millennia, or the Sumerians were using classification systems so different from ours that we cannot recognize the celestial objects they describe. Modern astronomers studying Sumerian tablets sometimes encounter observations that are accurate but incomprehensible, records of celestial phenomena that clearly happened but were recorded using conceptual frameworks that don't translate easily into contemporary scientific language. It's as if we're reading the work of competent observers who are looking at the same sky we see, but organizing their observations according to completely different principles. When we read Sumerian astronomical texts today, we're encountering not just ancient science, but an entirely different way of thinking about humanity's relationship to the cosmos. They saw the sky not as a mechanical system governed by impersonal laws, but as a community of divine beings whose activities were intimately connected to human affairs. Their astronomical knowledge was extensive, accurate, and practical, but it was organized according to principles that don't match our contemporary understanding of how scientific knowledge should be structured. They watched the heavens not just to predict celestial events, but to maintain their connection to cosmic order, to remember that everything in existence. Perhaps the most mysterious thing about Sumerian astronomy is how much of it we've lost. The observers who could read their star names, understand their classification systems, and participate in their cosmic dialogue have been gone for millennia. We can verify their observational accuracy and admire their predictive capabilities, but we can no longer fully comprehend the worldview that made their astronomical achievements possible. The voice of Enheduanna. On a clay tablet housed in the British Museum, wedge-shaped marks preserve words that were pressed into soft earth 43 centuries ago. The text begins with a line that makes your breath catch. I, Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god, will speak. This isn't just ancient literature, it's the first time in recorded human history that someone wrote down their thoughts and signed their name to them. Before Homer sang of Achilles, before the authors of Genesis set down the creation story, before Confucius recorded his teachings, a woman in ancient Mesopotamia was creating poetry that spoke directly from one human consciousness to another across the vast gulf of time. Enheduanna was born into power. As the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, she was appointed to one of the most influential religious positions in the ancient world, High Priestess of the Moon, god Nanna, at the temple in Ur. This wasn't merely a ceremonial role, but a position that combined spiritual authority with political responsibility. Her appointment was a strategic move by her father to unite the conquered Sumerian south with the Akkadian north through religious synthesis. But when we read her poetry today, we encounter something far more complex than political propaganda. In her most famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, Enheduanna writes with a voice that is immediately recognizable as human, individual, and deeply personal. She doesn't just praise the goddess, she pleads with her, argues with her, and reveals her own vulnerabilities in ways that feel startlingly modern. The poem tells the story of a crisis in her life when she was stripped of her priestly office and cast out from the temple. Her words carry the weight of genuine anguish. They have cast me out from my sanctuary like a swallow, my life is done. They made me walk in thorn bushes of the mountain. They took away the crown that is fitting for the high priesthood. This isn't the detached voice of official religious literature, but the cry of someone whose world has collapsed. She writes about losing her identity, her purpose, her very sense of who she is. But then something remarkable happens in the poem. She calls upon Inanna not just as a goddess, but as another woman, someone who might understand what it means to be powerful and vulnerable at the same time. The most extraordinary moment in Enheduanna's poetry comes when she describes her restoration to power. She attributes her return not to political maneuvering or family connections, but to the intervention of Inanna, who heard her prayer and responded. The goddess, she writes, took up the scattered me and restored them to her. The word me in Sumerian refers to the divine powers that govern civilization, law, art, warfare, wisdom. But in Enheduanna's hands, it also becomes something personal, the essential elements of selfhood that can be scattered by trauma and loss. What makes Enheduanna's voice so compelling across 4 millennia is its psychological complexity. She writes as both insider and outsider, powerful priestess and vulnerable woman, political figure and private individual. Her hymns blend personal confession with cosmic vision, intimate prayer with public declaration. She created a literary persona that was simultaneously larger than life and utterly human. Modern scholars debate whether Enheduanna actually wrote the texts attributed to her, or whether her name was attached to poems created by anonymous temple scribes. But this question misses something crucial. Whether she physically pressed the stylus to clay or not, the consciousness preserved in these poems is distinctly individual. Someone, whether Enheduanna herself or another writer working in her voice, understood that literature could be a vehicle for exploring the inner landscape of human experience. The survival of her work represents one of history's great accidents of preservation. Most ancient literature was copied and recopied by scribes who saw themselves as preserving important cultural traditions. Enheduanna's poems survived because they were considered both religiously significant and literarily excellent. They were studied in scribal schools for over 1,000 years after her death, which means that her voice was being heard and appreciated by readers across dozens of generations. What emerges from Enheduanna's poetry isn't just historical information or religious doctrine, but the irreducible fact of another human consciousness, someone who experienced joy and sorrow, confidence and doubt, triumph and loss in ways that we can still recognize and respond to. She didn't write to instruct future generations or preserve cultural knowledge. She wrote to give form to her own experience, to make sense of her place in a world that could be both wonderful and terrifying. In doing so, she created something that had never existed before in human history, a written record of what it feels like to be a particular person living through specific circumstances while grappling with universal human questions about power, faith, identity, and meaning. The earliest legal systems. On a clay tablet from the reign of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BC, a simple legal principle is recorded. If a man breaks another man's tooth, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Not an eye for an eye, but money for a tooth, a surprisingly practical approach to justice that prioritizes compensation over revenge. But just a few lines down, the same tablet records a harsher verdict. If a wife despises her husband and says, "You are not my husband," they shall throw her into the water. These contrasts raise a fundamental question. Was Sumerian law an attempt at justice, or simply another tool for maintaining social control? The Code of Ur-Nammu, carved into stone and clay over 4,000 years ago, represents one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to create written legal standards. Unlike the divine commandments or royal edicts of later civilizations, these laws deal with surprisingly mundane matters: property disputes, marriage contracts, rental agreements, workplace injuries. They read more like the bylaws of a homeowners association than the fundamental principles of cosmic justice. But perhaps that's precisely their significance. For the first time in recorded history, a society was attempting to resolve disputes not through the arbitrary decisions of powerful individuals, but according to fixed, publicly available standards. The idea that similar cases should be judged by similar principles, that penalties should be predictable rather than capricious, that legal reasoning should be based on precedent rather than personal preference. All of these foundational concepts of jurisprudence appear in embryonic form in Sumerian legal texts. Yet the system they created was far from what we would recognize as equitable justice. Sumerian society was rigidly hierarchical, divided into 3 distinct classes: the Lugal, nobility; the Lu, free citizens; and the Arad, slaves. The law applied differently to each group. A free man who struck a nobleman faced a heavier penalty than a nobleman who struck a slave. Women were generally treated as property, with most legal rights exercised by their fathers or husbands. This creates a puzzle for modern observers trying to evaluate Sumerian legal achievement. On one hand, they established crucial principles that would influence legal thinking for millennia: written statutes, consistent procedures, appeal processes, and professional judges. On the other hand, their system codified inequalities that we would consider fundamentally unjust. Perhaps most importantly, Sumerian legal thinking was integrated with their religious worldview in ways that provided both legitimacy and limits to earthly power. Laws were understood to come from the gods, particularly Shamash, the sun god associated with justice, and Enlil, the supreme deity who governed cosmic order. But this didn't make the legal system arbitrary. Instead, it meant that even kings were subject to divine law, that justice was seen as reflecting eternal principles rather than temporary political arrangements. This religious foundation also provided a framework for thinking about legal principles that transcended immediate practical concerns. Sumerian texts speak of justice as maintaining balance in the cosmos, of law as reflecting divine order, of courts as places where eternal truths are revealed through human institutions. These concepts may seem abstract, but they provided the intellectual foundation for legal thinking that would influence every subsequent civilization in the region. The durability of Sumerian legal concepts is remarkable. The Code of Hammurabi, created 6 centuries after Ur-Nammu, clearly builds on Sumerian legal precedents. Mesopotamian law continued to evolve through the Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian periods, but it remained recognizably connected to principles established in the earliest Sumerian courts. Even contemporary legal systems retain concepts, contracts, property rights, judicial procedures, precedent-based reasoning that trace back to those first law codes pressed into clay tablets. The clay tablets that preserve Sumerian legal records continue to astonish scholars with their sophistication and attention to detail. Cases involving complex commercial transactions, inheritance disputes that stretched across generations, criminal prosecutions that required careful evaluation of evidence, all are documented with precision that reveals a mature legal system operating according to well-established principles. By recording their legal principles and judicial decisions, the Sumerians made justice partially visible, somewhat predictable, and minimally accountable. They didn't eliminate injustice, no legal system ever has, but they created tools for recognizing it, challenging it, and gradually reducing it. The knowledge of medicine. A clay tablet from Nippur, written over 3,000 years ago, preserves a prescription that would puzzle any modern doctor. If the head hurts, boil well grass with honey, drink when the moon sets. If the head still hurts, write the name of Enki on clay, place under the pillow. The same symptom treated with both herbal medicine and ritual intervention. Were the Sumerians confused about the nature of disease, or did they understand something about healing that purely physical medicine misses? The question becomes more complex when you realize that many Sumerian herbal remedies have been verified by modern pharmacology as genuinely effective treatments. The role of the Azu, the Sumerian healer, reveals a medical practice that was both systematic and surprisingly sophisticated. These physician priests, who could be either male or female, maintained detailed records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. Their tablets describe different types of headaches with precision that modern neurologists recognize: pain localized to one side of the head, neck tension that radiates upward, fever-associated headaches that respond to cooling treatments. But their diagnostic categories extended far beyond physical symptoms. They classified diseases according to which divine forces might be involved, which ritual procedures were required alongside medical treatment, and which times of day or month were most favorable for healing. A patient with stomach pain might receive willow bark extract for inflammation, while also undergoing ceremonies to appease Gula, the goddess of healing, whose anger was thought to manifest as digestive disorders. This integration of physical and spiritual healing wasn't primitive confusion, but sophisticated understanding of what we might now call psychosomatic medicine. Sumerian healers recognized that illness affected the whole person, body, mind, and social relationships, and that effective treatment needed to address all these dimensions simultaneously. Their medical practice was holistic centuries before the term was invented. The depth of their anatomical knowledge is revealed in texts that describe the body with remarkable precision. They identified the liver as the center of blood production, understood the heart's role in circulating vital essence, and recognized the brain as connected to consciousness and personality. They performed cataract surgery, set broken bones with splints that allowed proper healing, and developed surgical instruments for treating wounds and extracting foreign objects. Their pharmaceutical knowledge was extensive and accurate. Sumerian medical texts catalogue hundreds of plants with specific therapeutic applications. Willow bark for pain and fever, the active ingredient in modern aspirin; garlic for infections; honey as an antiseptic; poppy extracts for severe pain. Modern analysis has confirmed that many of these treatments contain active compounds that produce the claimed medical effects. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed systematic approaches to diagnosis that involved careful observation of symptoms, examination of bodily functions, and tracking of disease progression over time. Medical tablets describe procedures for checking pulse rates, examining urine color and consistency, observing skin conditions, and monitoring changes in patient behavior and mental state. One particularly sophisticated text, known as the Treatise on Medical Diagnosis and Prognosis, reads like an early medical textbook. It systematically describes various diseases, their typical symptoms, likely outcomes, and recommended treatments. The diagnostic procedures it outlines, observation, palpation, questioning the patient about pain and discomfort, remain fundamental to medical practice today. Yet, alongside these rational diagnostic procedures, Sumerian medicine maintained elaborate systems for identifying spiritual causes of illness. Diseases were often attributed to divine displeasure, demonic possession, or violations of religious taboos. Treatment frequently involved ritual purification, offerings to specific deities, or ceremonial acts designed to restore the patient's proper relationship with supernatural forces. This dual approach might seem contradictory, but it served important psychological and social functions. Illness in ancient society wasn't just a personal medical problem, but a community crisis that required collective response. The ritual aspects of healing helped maintain social cohesion, provided emotional support for patients and families, and created structured ways for communities to respond to the anxiety and disruption that serious illness inevitably caused. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence of surprisingly sophisticated medical facilities in Sumerian cities. Temple complexes included areas specifically designed for treating patients, with clean water sources, spaces for preparing medicines, and rooms where healing rituals could be performed. Some sites show evidence of surgical procedures, including trepanation, surgical drilling of the skull to relieve pressure, performed with stone and copper tools. What's most striking about Sumerian medical texts is their practical focus on helping people feel better. Whether a treatment worked through active pharmaceutical compounds or through psychological and social mechanisms seems to have been less important to Sumerian healers than whether it actually helped their patients recover. They were pragmatic empiricists who used whatever methods proved effective, regardless of the theoretical explanations. This practical approach extended to their understanding of disease prevention. Sumerian medical texts include detailed instructions for maintaining health through proper diet, regular exercise, adequate sleep, and attention to emotional well-being. They recognized that preventing illness was often more effective than treating it after symptoms appeared. Standing in a museum today, looking at clay tablets covered with medical prescriptions written in cuneiform script, you're confronting one of humanity's earliest attempts to systematize the healing arts. These ancient healers developed diagnostic procedures, pharmaceutical treatments, and therapeutic approaches that remained influential for millennia. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that medicine at its best addresses not just physical symptoms, but the whole human person embedded within community, tradition, and cosmos. The Sumerian Great Flood Legend. In the Epic of Atrahasis, preserved on cuneiform tablets from the 18th century BC, the gods make a fateful decision. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. The solution is a flood that will wipe clean the earth with only one family preserved to restart civilization. If this sounds familiar, it should, but this Mesopotamian version of the flood story predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. Were the Sumerians recording memories of an actual catastrophic flood, or were they using natural disasters as raw material for stories about divine justice and human survival? The flood narrative appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. But it's in the Sumerian king list that we find perhaps the most intriguing reference. The document divides history into two distinct periods. After the flood swept over and the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This isn't just a story, it's presented as historical fact, a watershed moment that reset civilization and required divine authority to be redistributed among surviving cities. The earliest complete version of the flood story appears in the Epic of Ziusudra, where the hero plays the same role later assigned to Noah, building an ark, gathering animals, surviving the deluge, and receiving divine blessing for preserving life through catastrophe. But the Sumerian version includes details that suggest intimate familiarity with actual flood conditions, specific measurements for the boat, precise timing for the rising and receding waters, and practical advice for surviving in a world where normal landmarks have been obliterated. Archaeological evidence adds an intriguing layer to this literary tradition. Excavations at Shuruppak, Uruk, and other Sumerian sites have uncovered thick layers of water-laid sediment that interrupt the normal progression of human occupation. These flood deposits, dating to around 2900 to 2700 BC, contain no pottery shards or other cultural debris, suggesting they were laid down rapidly during major inundation events rather than through gradual river processes. At Shuruppak, the traditional home of Ziusudra, archaeologist Leonard Woolley found an 11-foot layer of clean clay separating two distinct periods of settlement. Similar deposits have been discovered at other sites, though they don't all date to the same period. This suggests that Lower Mesopotamia experienced several catastrophic floods during the early historical period, any one of which could have provided the kernel of truth around which the Great Flood narrative crystallized. But the evidence for actual flooding raises as many questions as it answers. The geological record shows no evidence of a single flood that inundated all of Mesopotamia simultaneously. The flood deposits at different sites date to different centuries, suggesting a series of local catastrophes rather than one universal deluge. Even the most extensive floods would have affected only the river valleys, leaving the surrounding highlands completely untouched. This has led some scholars to interpret the flood narrative not as history, but as political mythology. In this reading, the Great Flood serves as a symbolic reset button that allowed new dynasties to claim divine authority while erasing inconvenient aspects of their predecessors' legitimacy. The flood story provides cosmic justification for political change. The old order was so corrupt that the gods themselves destroyed it, leaving only the pure remnant to rebuild civilization according to divine will. Yet the persistence and specificity of flood traditions across Mesopotamian cultures suggests something more than political convenience. The story appears in Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts with remarkable consistency over more than 2 millennia. The details, the warning dream, the careful construction of the boat, the gathering of animals, the release of birds to test for dry land, the divine promise never to repeat such destruction, remains stable across cultures and centuries. This consistency becomes even more remarkable when we consider how the flood narrative spread beyond Mesopotamia. Similar stories appear in the mythology of cultures that had contact with Mesopotamian civilization: the Hebrew Bible, Greek legends of Deucalion, Hindu stories of Manu and the cosmic deluge. The pattern is so widespread that it suggests either common historical memory or universal psychological significance, possibly both. Modern climate science offers another perspective on the flood traditions. The end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BC, involved massive changes in global water levels as glacial ice sheets melted and flowed into the oceans. Sea levels rose over 400 feet, transforming coastlines worldwide and creating catastrophic flooding in low-lying areas. While this predates Sumerian civilization by millennia, Such dramatic environmental changes could have left deep impressions in human cultural memory. The Persian Gulf itself may preserve evidence of this ancient catastrophe. The current shoreline lies far north of where it would have been during the Ice Age, when much of the Gulf was dry land crossed by the extended courses of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As sea levels rose, this entire region would have been gradually submerged, potentially displacing large populations and creating exactly the kind of trauma that gets preserved in flood narratives. But perhaps we're asking the wrong questions about the Sumerian flood story. Instead of trying to determine whether it records actual events, we might ask what function it served in Mesopotamian culture and why it proved so durable and influential. The flood narrative addresses fundamental anxieties about the fragility of civilization, the unpredictability of natural forces, and the relationship between human behavior and cosmic order. In the Sumerian understanding, the flood wasn't just a natural disaster but a moral reckoning, divine judgment on a world that had lost its way. The survival of Ziusudra and his family represents the possibility of redemption, the hope that even after complete destruction, wisdom and goodness can preserve the essential elements of human culture. The rainbow that appears after the flood symbolizes not just meteorological recovery, but cosmic reconciliation between divine power and human need. The flood story suggests that they understood something profound about the nature of existence, that order is always temporary, that destruction and creation are intimately linked, and that survival depends not just on individual virtue, but on the preservation of essential knowledge through times of crisis. In their telling, the flood never truly ended. It became a permanent reminder of both human fragility and the enduring possibility of renewal. When you glance at your watch, the minutes divide into 60-second intervals according to mathematics developed in ancient Mesopotamia. When you type on a keyboard, the words flow left to right in lines that mirror the reading direction of cuneiform tablets. When you sign your name to a contract, you're participating in legal traditions that trace back to the first written agreements pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago. You've probably never heard of Ur-Nammu or studied the Epic of Gilgamesh in school. You couldn't locate Uruk on a map or explain the religious significance of ziggurats. Yet everywhere you look, in the structure of your calendar, the organization of your cities, the assumptions underlying your legal system, you're surrounded by the invisible inheritance of Sumerian civilization. How can a culture that vanished so completely still shape the way we organize reality? The paradox becomes even stranger when you consider that the Sumerians left behind no surviving monuments like the pyramids of Egypt, no continuing empires like those of China or Rome, no unbroken religious traditions like those preserved in India or Jerusalem. Their cities are buried under millennia of sand and silt, their language is extinct, their gods are forgotten, yet their influence on modern life may be more profound than any civilization that followed them. This isn't accidental cultural transmission, but something deeper. The Sumerians were the first people to solve fundamental problems of human organization that every complex society has had to address. They invented not just specific technologies, but entire categories of human activity. Before them, there was no writing, no formal education, no professional bureaucracy, no systematic law codes, no urban planning, no organized religion with permanent temples and trained priests. They created the first blueprints for civilization itself, and every society since has been working from variations of their original designs. Consider the simple act of reading these words. The concept of preserving human thought through visual symbols, of creating meaning through arrangements of marks that can be decoded by anyone who knows the system, this is a Sumerian invention. Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese characters developed independently, but the Mesopotamian tradition of cuneiform writing spread through the ancient world, and eventually evolved into the alphabetic systems we use today. More than just technology transfer, this represents a revolution in human consciousness. The Sumerians were the first people to realize that thoughts could exist outside individual minds, that knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across generations, that human memory could be extended beyond biological limits. They separated knowing from the knower in ways that made possible everything we recognize as human culture. Their influence extends far beyond writing into the fundamental structures of social organization. The idea of cities as centers of specialized economic activity, the concept of professional government administered by trained bureaucrats, the notion of formal education designed to transmit complex skills, all of these patterns were established in Sumerian city-states and have been variations on their original themes ever since. Even our stories follow patterns they established. The narrative of a great flood that resets human civilization appears in cultures around the world that had contact with Mesopotamian traditions. The heroic journey that takes a protagonist through trials and transformation, the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, the wise ruler who brings law and civilization to previously barbarous peoples, these archetypal stories originated in Sumerian literature and continue to shape how we understand human experience. But perhaps their most profound legacy lies in something even more fundamental. They were the first people to imagine that reality could be organized differently than it appeared in nature. Before the Sumerians, human societies were limited by biological relationships, seasonal cycles, and immediate geographic constraints. They created the first artificial systems for organizing human activity according to abstract principles rather than natural patterns. The city itself represents this revolutionary leap of imagination. Unlike villages that grew organically from extended family groups, Sumerian cities were planned communities that brought together people with no blood relationships, organized them according to specialized functions, and governed them through invented institutions rather than traditional kinship structures. This required new ways of thinking about identity, authority, and social relationships that we now take for granted but that had to be invented from nothing. Time itself became a Sumerian creation. Instead of measuring duration through natural cycles alone, the rising and setting of sun and moon, the changing of seasons, they divided time into artificial units that could be manipulated for administrative purposes. The 60-minute hour, the 24-hour day, the 7-day week, the 12-month year, all of these represent human decisions about how to organize temporal experience, and all trace back to Mesopotamian innovations. Picture a Sumerian scribe working late in a temple archive, copying legal documents by lamplight. The words he's preserving will outlast his own life, the institutions he serves, the very civilization that employs him. He doesn't know he's creating the foundations of literate culture, but with each pressed wedge mark, he's participating in humanity's first systematic attempt to make knowledge permanent. The symbols he inscribes in wet clay will eventually evolve into the letters flowing across your screen as you read this. The contracts he preserves will establish legal principles still used in contemporary courts. The stories he copies will echo in literature written thousands of years after his civilization has vanished completely. This is why Sumerian influence feels both pervasive and invisible. They didn't just create specific inventions, but entire categories of human activity. They established the templates for urban life, literate culture, formal education, professional government, systematic law, organized religion, and complex economic exchange. Every society that has developed these institutions has been working from blueprints they originally designed. Standing in the ruins of Ur today, looking at the crumbled remains of the world's first ziggurat, you might think this ancient civilization has been completely lost. But that's an illusion. Their monuments have crumbled, but their innovations have become so thoroughly integrated into human civilization that we can no longer imagine existence without them. They solved the basic problem of how to organize large numbers of strangers into cooperative communities, how to preserve knowledge across generations, how to create stability and predictability in social relationships, how to coordinate complex economic activities across time and space. These achievements are invisible not because they've disappeared, but because they've become the assumed foundation for everything we recognize as civilized life. Every time you read a book, attend school, appear in court, deposit money in a bank, vote in an election, or participate in religious services, you're using social technologies that the Sumerians invented. You're thinking thoughts that can only be thought within conceptual frameworks they created. You're living in a world they first imagined into existence. The deeper mystery isn't how their influence spread, but how it became so fundamental to human consciousness that we've forgotten it's an inheritance rather than a natural condition. We live inside Sumerian innovations so completely that they've become invisible, like the air we breathe or the assumptions that structure our perception of reality. In the end, perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about Sumerian civilization. They didn't just create the first cities or the first writing system or the first formal institutions. They created the first human attempt to organize reality according to principles that transcend immediate biological and environmental constraints. They taught our species to think beyond the given world into possibilities that could be created through imagination, effort, and collective action. 5,000 years after their cities were buried by shifting sands, we're still living in the world they dreamed into existence. The stylus that first pressed meaning into clay has become the cursor that traces light across screens, but the fundamental act remains the same: human consciousness extending itself beyond individual limits through symbolic systems that make knowledge shareable and permanent. The Sumerians didn't disappear. They became us,